Hi, and welcome to this video where I show you how I create 3 different backgrounds using narrow washi tape and various art materials. If you're new to this channel, hi, my name is Ina. If not, great to have you back. For the first background, I'm working in Morgentau, or in English Twilight Garden, by Maria Trolle. I've chosen this page with the flowers. Here are 2 of the narrow rolls of washi tape that I showed in my last haul. One roll is even narrower than the other. My plan is to paint the entire page with watercolors. I also want to paint over the motif, without worrying about coloring each petal and leaf individually. The paint will serve as a base to later color over with colored pencils. I'll start now with this washi tape, which is the wider of the 2. I want to create a border along the edge of the page, but not completely at the edge, leaving a small gap. Ideally, I would measure the distances, but I'm just going to eyeball it and hope it turns out fairly even in the end. You might have just seen me test how sticky the tape is. If it's too sticky, you should stick it to your skin or a piece of non-fuzzy clothing before applying it to the paper, so that it doesn't tear the page when you remove it. Since the page isn't lying completely flat, it's not that easy to apply the strips straight. But because the tape can be easily removed, it's easy to correct. As you can see, I roughly measure the length and then tear off the tape before sticking it down. At this point, I'm considering whether I want to place the tape so that there's a white border around it, or if the tape should go all the way to the edge. I decided on the second option. Since the horizontal strip of tape is slightly too short, I'll add small strips of tape later. This can happen when the idea fully develops during the process. Even here, with the last strip of this frame, I'm making some adjustments. Now I'm taking the really narrow washi tape to create another smaller frame with a small gap from the other one. This time I'm paying attention to the correct length right away, because I want the tape to go all the way to the outer edge again. The small piece of the tape that's too long I simply wrap around the page, but you don't have to do that. So that looks pretty even. I'm now setting the washi tape aside and placing some scrap paper behind the page for protection. Next, I'm using a wider washi tape to prevent the watercolors from bleeding into the other side. I would say this is the standard width, if there's such a thing for washi tape. I've already used a strip of tape on another page, but it's still sticky, so I'm just using it again. Okay, now it's time for the watercolors. I'm using this paint set, which I once got from a discount store years ago, and it's not from any well-known brand. I also be using this palette because the colors are well pigmented, and when I have them on the palette, I have better control over how much paint and water I actually have on the brush. I will set the book aside briefly to test the colors on this scrap paper. The yellow is too intense for my liking, so I'm diluting it with a bit of water. I'm doing the same with the other colors. Now that I'm happy with the colors, I'm ready to start. I was a bit nervous because I've already tried to use as little water as possible. But since I want the colors to blend beautifully here, I decided to give a go with plenty of water. That's also the reason why I'm holding up the other side of the page. This way the page lies flat and the colors don't flow due to the curved surface. I'm taking a large brush and thoroughly wetting the page to use the wet on wet technique, even though it's a bit daunting to use so much water. It felt quite strange, especially since I know it's not watercolor paper. Now I'm going for the yellow, and the plan was to light tap the wet paper with the tip of the brush, allowing the color to spread and different hues to blend into each other. But the page isn't as wet as I thought, because the paper absorbs the water quite strongly. I'd be curious to know if this is only the case with the German version or with all Maria Trolle books. Since the colors aren't spreading on their own, I'm using the larger brush again to work more quickly. The paper really absorbs every bit of moisture immediately, which is why I'm now applying the paint directly in some areas. At that moment, I didn't really know what I was doing or how I could fix it, because initially the paper didn't seem like the type that would absorb water so strongly and quickly. At this point, I just thought hopefully I'll be able to salvage it later. It really didn't look good in the end. This was also partly because the illustration on the back has a black background that is now showing through, and I hoped it would look better once the page had dried. So I crossed my fingers and waited. What you didn't see in the video is that the orange color appeared to bleed through quite intensely. I was already prepared to turn the reverse side into an autumn-themed page with orange foliage. Okay, let's take a look together at how the page looks now that it's dry. Don't be surprised that the book was closed. It was already the next day, which is why I had closed it. It looks a bit blotchy here, but on the reverse side you can only see a slight hint of orange in this area, whereas it was really bright orange when it was wet. The page is also pretty wavy, but I'm sure pressing it will help improve that a bit. What usually helps when the background hasn't turned out as hoped, or when you feel like something missing? Exactly, dots and paint splatters. For this, I use a bristle brush with firm bristles, but you can also use a toothbrush, and I scatter splatters in various colors across the page. Along the way, I realized it would be wise to protect the other side. I exclusively use the colors I've already worked with. Through this time, they are less diluted. After letting this dry as well, I can remove the washi tape strips. And yes, I wrap the tape back around the roll, because as long as it's still sticky enough, I can reuse it. My scrap paper usually consists of the back of printed pages I no longer need. Before discarding them, I simply reuse them to place behind a page or to test color combinations, and so on. Here's the finished background. I really like the frame. Here's a close-up of the page so you can see the fine paint splatters more clearly. Now I give you a little sneak peek into how I color this page. I've selected the colors you see in the top left. Ultimately, I decided against using the green colored pencils. When coloring, I always try to use the shades suggested by the watercolors, but in darker tones. You'll see the completed page in my completed pages video at the beginning of September. For the second background, I'm working in Creatopia by Wax. I've chosen this page with a turtle. Here I like to create diagonal stripes in this direction and that direction, and then color the entire page with Castle Arts watercolor pencils to resemble water. Which washi tape should I use for this? The narrower or the wider one? I go with the narrower one. First, I just use the strips I've already used for the other background and stick them over the page. I can feel that the tape still sticks well enough, because if it didn't, the color could seep underneath. It would probably make more sense to measure the spacing here, but I don't feel like doing that right now. And it works this way too. No one is going to measure it in the end anyway. This is a longer strip from the previous page, but unfortunately it's not long enough, so I'm using it in the opposite direction. I'm deliberately placing the strips so that no right angles are formed. Now that I've used up the old strips, I'm using new tape. It's time for the watercolor pencils. The plan is to have it get darker from top to bottom. To bring some dynamics to the water, I always mix two different colors. First, I'll check my swatch book to see which color I would like to use. I start with cobalt turquoise light, moving the pencil horizontally. Then I use jade green to fill in the gaps. It'll be more visible once I add the darker colors. The next color is cobalt turquoise, followed by cerulean blue light. I'll continue with blue tones. Next comes sky blue, and for the darkest shade, I'll use ultramarine light. At that moment, it still looks a lot like a water surface, but by the end, you won't see much of this texture anyway. Moving on with the slightly greenish tones. I'm using jade green again, before switching to a darker color. Now I'm using teal green and at the very bottom, hookah's green. To blend the watercolor pencils, I use a watercolor brush. I protect the pages underneath with scrap paper, which can also be secured well with the overhanging tape. Okay, here we go. In the upper area, I've left some sections white, which means you can't see a huge effect just yet. It's important to always make horizontal strokes to maintain the water's texture. In this small area, I forgot the jade green, and since the section is already wet, I'm taking the color directly from the pencil. Every time I dip the brush back in water, I dab off the excess water on a cloth. I also like doing this on my finger or the back of my hand. That way I can feel if the brush is too wet or not. Also, it's over 30 degrees here, so it's a little bit of a cool down. I'm quite pleased with how it looks so far. I'll get this side dry completely again before removing the washi tape. Now I'm peeling off the strips and saving the washi tape because it's still sticky enough. Normally I wouldn't keep this tiny strips, but I know I can use them well for the third background. When peeling off the tape, you need to be careful about which strip is on the top and which is underneath. Otherwise, the page can easily tear at the overlaps. This is the finished background. It wasn't until this point that I realized it looks like a fishing net. This could be a reference to how turtles often get caught in ghost nets, but that wasn't my intention at all. Alright, let's continue with the third and final background. I'm creating this one in vintage flowers from the publisher Busse Seewald. I've chosen the page featuring the lily. Here I want to do something a bit wild, an abstract background with mixed media. I'll start with washi tape again, using short strips scattered randomly across the page, without any particular pattern. But first I'll place 2 sheets behind the actual page to protect it. Apologize that the bottom edge of the page isn't visible in the moment. Next I'm taking a white wax crayon and drawing various shapes and lines on the page. For some reason the crayon briefly drew in red, but since the page is meant to be a bit crazy, it fits perfectly. After that I'm using a few of my Jaxon watercolor crayons. The idea is that the water-based colors won't adhere to the wax crayon, making the shapes visible in the end. For this I'm using the colors ochre, salmon pink, yellow-orange and a yellow crayon for kids from Herlitz, which is also water-soluble. Here too I'm applying the colors freely, crisscrossing over the paper. You can already see where I used the white crayon. The shapes and lines stand out nicely. In some spots, I'm mixing the colors by layering them on top of each other. They'll blend properly once activated with water. Before doing that, I'm adding another strip of washi tape in the middle to protect the other side. Now I show you a time lapse of how I blend the crayons. If you'd like to learn more about the Jaxons, I've created 3 backgrounds with them before, and I've linked the video in the top right corner. If you want to darken the background, you can apply the Jaxon more opaquely or add another layer. You can already see that it would have been better if I had applied the regular crayon a bit more thickly or made the lines wider. Then it would be more visible. But well, another lesson learned, and I can do it better next time. By the way, this watercolor brush is from a relatively inexpensive set, but I really love it. Of course, I don't have a comparison to a brush that costs 20, 50 or even more euros, but I find it very good. I link the set under the video in case you're interested. If the transition between two colors is too harsh for me, I simply go over it again and blend it. I let this side dry again, before continuing with acrylic paints. Here I have a white acrylic paint from Schminke in the Academy version, and an orange, light green and yellow from C. Kreul Künstlerfarbenfabrik. I'm now putting them on a palette, diluting them with water until I can create good paint splatters. And then I'll add splatters to the page. Somehow it's always a cool effect. The paints are all a bit older and accordingly not as fluid as they once were, but it still works. I want to create larger splatters than in the first background. I highly recommend covering your workspace and wearing a paint smock or something similar, because I ended up covered in paint splatters, and acrylic paint cannot be washed out once it's dried. With the green paint, the brush was still a bit dirty, but I actually prefer the darker green result. As for the white paint, the components had separated, making the paint very fluid, so I didn't need to add extra water. This too needs to dry again. I also have a few acrylic stamps that I'm going to use now. Since I wasn't sure how well the ink pad would still work, I tested the stamps beforehand. Unfortunately, the butterfly didn't turn out perfectly due to the page's curvation. But that can't be changed now. At least I don't want to paint over it with acrylics. Then I used a dragonfly stamp and a sort of mandala, which I placed at the edge. I had some issues here as well. I could have done more, but I thought less is more in this case. Now it's time to throw away the washi tape after using it 3 times, even though I feel like it would still stick well enough. Here is the third finished background. In my next completed pages video, you'll be able to see how all the 3 pages turned out. I hope you enjoyed the video and found it helpful. Bye and hopefully see you next time.